Like he's gonna get cold from the bushes.
I know it's bothering me.
Or when he's driving into town, he's got the mask on.
Good evening and welcome to the Monterey Peace and Justice Center. I'm Catherine Crockett, President of the Monterey Peace and Justice Center. Thank you all for being here to hear Dr. Lin speak. I also want to welcome those who are viewing tonight's presentation live streamed. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted on MPJC's YouTube channel. I'd like to take a pause right here at the Monterey Peace and Justice Center in Seaside, California, to recognize and acknowledge the indigenous people of this land, the Ohlone, Costanoan, Esselen Nation. We remember their continued existence and connection to this region and give them thanks for allowing us to live, work, learn, and gather in their traditional homeland. We recognize the enduring relationship that exists between indigenous people and their traditional lands, and we offer our respect to their elders and to all Ohlone people of the past and present. We're happy to reopen the center after more than a year. It's great to have Dr. Sharat Lin as our first speaker. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Monterey Peace and Justice Center, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Monterey County Branch, and the Peace Coalition of Monterey County. To stay informed about events here at the center and around Monterey County, you can find our weekly peace calendar on our website at peacecentral.org, and you can also subscribe there. So the center is open and staffed on Wednesdays only, but you can come by anytime between 1 and 5:30 p.m. to visit, look at the bulletin board, browse our lending library, or just visit. So in 2021, an estimated 250,000 Indians waged strikes against India to protest agricultural reforms, which farmers say will have left them at the mercy of big corporations. Dr. Sharat G. Lin will present his analysis of this massive popular uprising, its historical underpinnings, and its potential to transform the political landscape of India. Dr. Lin is affiliated with a Human Agenda and Initiative for Equality. He writes and lectures on global political economy, labor migration, social movements, and public health. He's been on the front lines of some epic moments in history, such as the aftermath of the Naxalbari movement in India, the Cultural Revolution in China, Palestinian West Bank and Gaza during the early years of occupation, and Egypt during the Arab Spring uprising in 2011-2012, to name a few. So thank you for joining us tonight, Dr. Lin. Please welcome Sharat Lin.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I guess it's a real honor to be the first speaker to reopen so to speak, the Monterey Peace and Justice Center. And I always enjoy coming here and, resuming meeting in person and seeing live faces. And I also took the liberty of saying that, well, I'm going to come to, since it's some distance, from San Jose, to come here, and the traffic also is sometimes problematic. I said I'm going to come early and then just do a few things, enjoy a few things around in this area. Then I know that I'm only 15 minutes away from this center, and I can relax. So I took a bike ride this early afternoon. In Monterey, there's a dedicated bicycle path, so that was very, very nice, and I didn't have to stress about the traffic. So I'm going to talk today about India because it's a country where, although I haven't been to India in recent years for various reasons, just because I've been busy with other issues. And then in the past, year and a half because of COVID. It has not been possible to travel to India. But a lot of things have happened in recent years in India, that more of them that are alarming, and they deserve more attention, more understanding on the part of the American people, because India is, after all, a very large country, and for since the beginning of well, for many centuries, India has been one of the two largest countries on the planet. And after partition in 1947, in which British India was divided into India, Pakistan, which at that time was Pakistan East and West. So what is today Pakistan and Bangladesh? It was split, and ever since then, India has been the second most populous country on the planet. It's going to retake that position, given the current population growth rates in China versus India. It's not that India has a terribly high population growth rate. Its neighbor Pakistan has a much higher population growth rate, and that's why Pakistan, which used to be, when Pakistan was split in 1971, Pakistan had a smaller population. West Pakistan had a smaller population than East Pakistan, which is today's Bangladesh. And today, Pakistan has over, 210, 220 million people, versus Bangladesh with about 170. So the population in Pakistan has grown much more rapidly. India is more like Bangladesh, because these two countries have family planning programs. And then there's also economic development, there's tangible economic development, where the per capita income has increased, even though it has been very uneven. And so inequality will always be a big factor in India, Bangladesh, and even more so in Pakistan. To give you some idea, so the Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality. It's a quantitative measure of inequality in societies, and so the Gini coefficient for India is roughly similar to the Gini coefficient for the United States. And so it's not the extreme inequality of Brazil or South Africa, but it is not an egalitarian society either. So it's kind of in the middle. Now, the kind of questions that I'm seeking to answer in this talk are that, given the trends that we see in India today, it is widely touted in the US media as the world's largest democracy. The US government seeks alliances with the government of India as a counterbalance to China, as well as to Russia. And so we need to understand, what is behind all of this. Why does the United States choose to ally itself with India versus China? Why does India go along with that? And what are the trends within India? We have a right-wing government in India under the Bharatiya Janata Party, and this party, as many of you know, is a Hindu nationalist party, and so it is taking India on a course that deviates from its historical secularism, the historical separation of state and religion. And we need to understand, what that's all about And then the COVID crisis, is another thing. I mean, in India, Brazil, and in the United States are the three countries that have had the largest number of COVID cases and COVID deaths in the world. And it's worthwhile to spend a little bit of time looking at that and the different responses of these countries. So these are some of the issues that I want to cover. And then the question of human rights. I mean, human rights is often a subject matter that is often brought up particularly by the US government in relation to China, in relation to countries that are considered adversaries, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and it's interesting that the human rights issues are not raised with respect to countries that are considered US allies. And that's deliberate. I think it's important to understand that. And I want to do some comparisons in that area. So there's a lot that I would like to cover to sort of update us as to what's happening in India. Now, that graphic of the people inside the map of India is an image of some of the mass demonstrations that have taken place in the national Pharma Strike. Now, India has had many massive strikes in its history. There was back in 1974, there was a national railway strike. Now, the Indian Railways, in terms of carrying passengers, is easily the largest railway system in the world, and certainly the largest railway system under a single administration. And so there were 2 million. There were 1974, and there were 2 million railway workers who went on strike. So when things happen in India, they tend to happen on a gargantuan scale. Now, this farmer strike, which really got kicked off in November of last year, was said to have involved 250 million Indian farmers, but interestingly, not just the farmers, but also farm workers. Now, those of you who have studied political economy know that farmers, when we talk about farmers, what we're talking about technically are not simply cultivators, but people who own land. They own the land that they are cultivating. And so they are owners of agricultural capital, okay, or at least some aspects of agricultural capital, namely the land. Maybe not all their equipment, but farm workers, on the other hand, are cultivators who work for a wage, and so they don't own the land. So the class interests of these two sets of people are different, and the fact that both of them would go out on strike, they would stop work in a national farmer strike is something that is remarkable and is worth exploring further, because this is part of the challenge of forging revolutionary movements that are based not upon the push from one class, but on creating class alliances. Because when you create class alliances, that means that there's a larger section of the population that is backing social change, radical departure from what the government is doing. Now, some other images. So there are different organizations, farmers' organizations. Now, one of the features of India that makes the movement, the social movement landscape, very dynamic and enduring, is the fact that the political parties are not inactive between elections. Right here in the United States, we have this election cycle. Every 4 years or every 2 years, we have the elections, and then there are the election campaigns that take place, in a month before an election, and in between, there isn't too much activity. Certainly, the voters are not very engaged. In India, one of the features is that the major political parties have all cultivated mass organizations. And what I mean by mass organizations, I mean, for example, this one. So this one is AIKS. So All India Kisan Sabha. So Kisan means farmer, and Sabha means an organization. So this is an All India Farmers Organization, and it's a mass organization of the Communist Party of India, Marxist, CPIM. And just to take an example, CPIM has AIFS, so the All India Students Federation. It has C2. C2 is the central, the Center for Indian Trade Unions. Okay, so it has a trade union federation, and there's an All India Women's Federation. All of them tied to the Communist Party of India. Marxist Congress Party has similar mass organizations for women, for youth, for scheduled castes, so the so-called untouchables, for Dalits, the Dalits, and then also for tribals, the Adivasis, workers, and so these are the mass organizations. The current ruling party, even though it's a right-wing party, also has its mass organizations. Some of them are of a different kind. Some of them are quasi, what I would call quasi-fascist, and we'll get into that. But anyway, these mass organizations are working at much more at the grassroots level on dealing with daily issues that each one of these segments of the population face. And so when an issue arises, here a farmers organization, a farmers federation mobilizes its members in response to something that's happened in the country. So and this was there was a point, I think it was in January, when farmers converged on Delhi. Delhi is the capital, and they basically said that we are going to sit down on the freeways that enter the Delhi, and Delhi has grown. When I was a youth, Delhi had 3 million people, and today it has more than 25 million. And so it's become this huge region, and the roads that used to come into the city were all, in my youth, were little 2-lane highways. And today there are these giant freeways, many lanes in each direction, as you can see in the background of this picture. But the farmers came in January. They blocked these freeways by camping out on the border, the Delhi border, and then block the traffic. And then you see the scale when they cook food for people. They cook it on a huge scale, and they were there for months. And some of these signs tell you that the government was trying to portray the farmers as terrorists, that they were disruptors, that they were anti-patriotic, and so this is a sign that just shows the response. So what is happening with this farmer strike, and how is it possible that here in the US media, there's almost no mention of it. The fact that in November, there was a mobilization of 250 million people. It's almost the population of the entire United States was on strike. And it's astounding. So let's put this into some context. First of all, in the 1980s, in the 1980s, India was embarking on a path of so-called liberalization of its economic policies. And this was a transition from the Nehru period, right after independence. Nehru was pledged to develop India. And remember that coming out of colonialism, we have to understand that British colonialism extracted so much wealth out of India that before the East India Company, India was one of the wealthiest countries on the planet. And British colonialism sucked that wealth out, so that by 1947, it was one of the poorest. And so for Nehru, it was about recovering from colonialism. It was about how do we catch up with the West, Europe and the United States, which were the leading economies at that point in time. And his vision was that India could not undertake this development on a capitalist, on a purely capitalist path that followed the model of the West. And he believed that because one thing that he knew and he understood correctly was that Indian capitalism was underdeveloped. It was undercapitalized. It had a sluggish nature that I don't have really time to explain why that is. I mean, other than to say that is an outcome of British rule, of rule by an outsider, and the suppression of the natural forces of the natural entrepreneurship that a people would have. I mean, for example, if Britain, at one point, prohibited India from building spinning and weaving mills, textile mills, because it wanted the textile mills to be developed in Manchester and Birmingham, and it wanted India to supply the cotton and also to provide the market for the finished cloth. And so this is an example of how Indian capitalism was stunted. So Nehru said, okay, we're going to have to help Indian capitalism develop by that the state has to provide infrastructure. Now, this is what he sometimes called socialism. To me, it's not socialism, but it's a state infrastructural support for capitalist development. It is a public sector. So what that means, for example, is that industries that Indian private capital did not have the strength or desire to get into, for example, at that time, at the time of independence, power and steel required a scale of investment that the Indian private sector was not prepared to do. And so steel was one thing, and power distribution, power grids. These were things that were taken up by the government of India in state-owned enterprises. In the 1980s, there was a change of philosophy that now it was time for India to open up its economy, to privatize and open up to foreign investment. and this neoliberalism was also about, what do we do in the agricultural sector? Because the agricultural sector, you have to understand that at that time in the 1980s, more than 60%, maybe 70% of the population of India was engaged in agriculture, and that agricultural sector was in transition from semi-feudalism into a capitalist form of agriculture. And it was very varied, so that's an oversimplification, but it was in transition and was still struggling to feed the population of India. And so, the Green Revolution was one of the first aspects of the liberalization, was to bring in external inputs, to mechanize, to bring in fertilizers and so on, and high yielding varieties of seed, and try to reinvigorate Indian agriculture. And that was focused in Punjab, a northern state that is sometimes thought of as the breadbasket of India, in the sense that it's a small state population-wise, but it produces the greatest surplus particularly in terms of wheat and rice. Anyway, so that neoliberalism started in the 1980s with reforms in the agricultural sector, but they were limited because the farmers or the rural voters were this huge voting bloc, and so they insisted that no, we cannot allow Walmarts and Tesco's to come into India, and we have to put limits on the artificial inputs that are provided by Monsanto and Bayer. So there were these limitations placed upon foreign investment. In the 1980s, that begins to change, and by 1990, Monsanto is there in full force. It's selling GMO seeds. In fact, it's for example, the BT cotton. One of the famous cases is the BT cotton, which is the cotton that has a terminator gene. So you buy the seed, you plant the cotton, and it's supposed to give you these very high yields if you provide the proper inputs. But the seeds are useless. They're sterile. So every year you have to buy new seed from Monsanto, and farmers were going into debt because of this. And so these farmers felt that they were just hopelessly in debt, and they could never be able to pull out of it, and they started committing suicide. And so today, as of today, more than 300,000 farmers have committed suicide. And then I was just reading that, something that I hadn't known before, and that was that as many, I'm trying to, we don't have the data. Here's the problem, we don't have the data. And so I was trying to do some extrapolations, and I realized the extrapolations, I don't have a scientific basis for making those extrapolations. But there are some months where we know that for every farmer suicide, there were 4 farm worker suicides. Okay, so the number is potentially much bigger than 300,000. So that's a stress. That's a stressor in the agricultural sector. The National General Strike of Farmers in November of last year was in specific response to 3 new laws that were passed by the this right-wing Bharatiya Janata Party government. So the one was, I don't want to get into the details on them, but what's important to know about them is the following. One is the Farmers, Produce, Trade, and Commerce Act, which it does many things, but the most important thing to know is that it opens the produce trade to all private places and opens it to e-commerce. Now, to understand this, we have to understand what was happening before. So before, the trade in agricultural commodities was largely centralized through the Indian government, the central government, through two major, most importantly, two entities. One is the State Trading Corporation, and then the FCI, the Food Corporation of India. So Indian farmers would sell their produce at designated locations to intermediaries who are required by law to pay something called the MSP, the minimum support price for agricultural commodities that is set by the central government. And then they would buy this from the farmers in what are called mandis. These are these designated locations, controlled places, and then sell it to the central government, to the FCI, the FCI or the state trade STC. What this would do is it would mean that private traders would be able to buy totally separately from this regulatory system, and they could bypass the state trading agencies entirely and abolish the minimum support price. So farmers feel that the prices that they're going to get for their produce is going to drop. The second one is farmers' agreement on price assurance and farm services. And the main thing this does is it provides a legal framework for farmers to enter into contracts with private traders. So it works hand in hand with the other law. And then there's the Essential Commodities Amendment Act of 2020, which removes a number of essential commodities from the essential commodities list. And so the impact of the essential commodities is first of all that these have very strict regulation of minimum support price, and they go into the state trading system to supply ration shops. So because big percentage of the Indian population is at or below poverty level, there has been a system of ration shops in operation virtually since independence, where you can buy essential things like wheat flour, like rice, like sugar, like cooking oil. You can buy these at a subsidized price, particularly if you're poor. And so removing these from the essential commodities list means taking them out of the ration system. So it's going to affect consumers as well. And how does the government do this? Well, first of all, why hasn't this happened earlier? If neoliberalism was starting in 1980s, why didn't it happen earlier? Well, because first of all, because the government could not get a vote. It would not have passed the parliament. India has two houses of parliament, the Lok Sabha or lower house, and the Rajya Sabha or upper house. And even today, these bills will not have passed the Rajya Sabha. So it's interesting how governments use technicalities to get around voting in the parliament. So what they do is there is a provision that says that, okay, if these bills are money bills, if they're revenue bills, then it only requires a vote in the Lok Sabha. So these are rationalized as money bills, even though they're not. They're clearly not money bills. These are policy bills. And so in that sense, it's unconstitutional. But the government is getting away with it because the courts, including the Supreme Court, have been stacked. And so the courts have not blocked these laws and said that, okay, this is being done in a manner that is unconstitutional. And then that agriculture is a state list. So that means that the regulation of agriculture under the Constitution is a state subject, provincial subject. And then the rationalization for the central government taking that up is that the produce goes into interstate trade, and therefore the central government can regulate it and reform it. So this is what's happening. The farmers are protesting against it, not only because of what these laws represent, but because they're being passed in a way which is very devious, and which anyone who looks at it, objectively, can see that it's being done in a way that violates the Constitution. Okay, so next I want to, and this farmer strike is still going on. I mean, it's what you will see if you look at images of it. You'll see a lot of Punjabi. The Punjabis are the Sikhs. Well, not all of them are Sikhs, but many of them are Sikhs, who are the men with the turbans are Sikhs. And the reason that you see a lot of Sikhs in those pictures is because these are the fairly well-off farmers comparatively, because once again, Punjab has one of the highest per capita incomes in the country, and because these farmers Punjab is adjacent to Delhi, so it's easy for them to camp out around Delhi, but it would be very difficult for a farmer who lives in the south, which is 1,500 kilometers away, to come to Delhi for a protest and get photographed by the media. Now I want to talk a little bit about the COVID crisis and how the government has handled it. And in the first table here, and I've circled the numbers for the United States back in January, the COVID pandemic peaked in the United States, and this day probably wasn't the peak day, but it's the one that I sampled the data for, where we had over 300,000 new cases in the US, and we had over 4,000 deaths from COVID. India, meanwhile, had only 18,000 new cases and had only a little over 200 deaths. So that was the situation then. And many people, as of that at that point, thought that India would have suffered much more. They were expecting, even I was expecting, much more, for reasons that I will discuss in the next slide. And then it happened. So we're talking about 4 months later. India, the US is getting vaccinated. So our case rates have gone down to below 50,000. And the death rate has gone below 1,000 at that time. And meanwhile, India surged to over 400,000 new cases per day. and almost 4,000 deaths per day. And to put it in perspective, though, if you look at it as a percentage of population, the U.S. peak was much worse, right? The U.S. peak was about 4 times worse than the Indian peak. This was the COVID case rate recently, about 2 months ago, and you see there are certain states, particularly the state here, which is the state of Maharashtra, and the state of Kerala down in the south. And in a way, this surprised me because Kerala is that state in the far south is a unique state. It's one state which is poor, but it has an exceptional healthcare system. And for example, it produces the largest surplus of nurses. And Maharashtra also is a relatively developed state, but it includes some of the most crowded slums in the world. Okay, including, for example, Dharavi in Mumbai. So Dharavi is imagine this. So it's 2 square kilometers. 2 square kilometers with over 1 million people. Okay. So we thought that Dharavi would be impacted much earlier in the pandemic, and so what happened was that there were a lot of state agencies and also private nonprofits went in there and they did the preventive work, they did the contact tracing, and they were able remarkably to keep the incidence of COVID in places like Dharavi very low until the spring, and so finally it hit. But one of the reasons why the COVID crisis was mismanaged was that the central government, the Prime Minister Modi, announced on the 24th of March, 2020, a lockdown. It was very sudden. There was no preparation. He said, the economy is locked down. And what this meant was that, well, if your home is local, if you're working near your home, it's not a problem. You just stay home. And, there's some aid coming through. It's nothing like what we had here. But people could survive because they at least had shelter over their heads. And they had family that they could rely on. But what about the tens of millions of migrant workers? So these migrant workers, many of them are living in housing that is provided by their employers. So when the lockdown hit, these employers let these migrant workers go, and they had no housing. They had no choice but to scramble for a way home. But when the lockdown was announced on 24th March 2020, the Indian railways were shut down. The largest railway system in the world was shut down. And the only way for them to go home was to walk. And what this was here was that they were crammed at bus stations. The only alternative was bus. And so they were just crowded together like this. And we thought, okay, this is going to be the super spreader event of the global pandemic. It didn't quite happen. These are people going on foot, and then finally, when the trains opened up, so this is a month later. Well, not a month later, but a few weeks later. No, it is. It's over a month later. Over a month later, trains started going. See that it's so much more orderly because now, people had time to get educated and physical distancing was put into place. Masks. At the beginning of the pandemic, just like here, we didn't have masks. And then there are things like this, which I see as an example of an authoritarian regime that does things without understanding what is the human impact. So this is bleach. So these are migrant workers returning to their hometowns, and on arrival, they're sterilized by spraying them with bleach. So it's just horrific. So the situation now is that you think of India as this poor country, but a lot of its coronavirus response infrastructure is absolutely as modern as it is here. A lot of it is online in multiple languages, and so what this is, it's just like the COVID dashboard in most of the counties of California. You go onto that dashboard, you can find out, how many cases are there, where are the cases, where can you get tested, where can you get vaccinated, and of course it requires internet access, right? But so it's true that in a poor country, a lot of people don't have wired internet access, but there are something like 900 million smartphones in India. 900 million smartphones. So people do have access that way. And you can look up, okay, where are COVID beds available, what oxygen beds are, is what we're talking about is a hospital bed where that hospital has oxygen cylinders. There are two ways of dealing with respiratory insufficiency in severe COVID cases, right? So one is ventilators, and then the other one is oxygen. It's interesting to me that the NIH, the US NIH itself, published a study or a recommendation that said that it recommended oxygen. It recommended intubated oxygen in preference to ventilation, and yet nobody talks about oxygen in this country. Nobody talks about ventilation. But in India, there's been a scramble for oxygen, and there were not enough oxygen cylinders. Because for convalescent plasma and so on and so on. So just to give you some examples. And then this is their response to sort of like essential workers that you can go out during the lockdown if you are an essential worker, if you have a good enough reason for going out. And that is this e-pass application system. So there's just some examples of the kind of infrastructure that has, and some of which we don't even have here in the US. India is the world's largest vaccine producer. Okay, it has that infrastructure to produce more vaccines, per day than any other country in the world. And India is making the biggest contribution to the COVAX initiative. I don't know how many of you know about COVAX. So COVAX, see, here's the thing, the news here talks about what's happening in the US. It doesn't talk about, what the rest of the world is doing. And COVAX is an example of the way vaccine distribution should have happened. And that is under the direction of the WHO, World Health Organization. And what the WHO wanted was to take the world's total production of COVID vaccines, pool them, and then redistribute them according to population. And that is what, and of course, because of vaccine nationalism, only maybe I don't know, 15, 20% of the vaccines that have been produced so far have gone through COVAX. The rest has been bought up directly by national governments. And then some governments like Britain and Israel have bought more vaccine than they actually need. Meanwhile, other countries, 100 countries in the world have received hardly anything, even now. So this is the problem. So COVAX would have, India has been the biggest provider of vaccines to COVAX. Another thing that you may have heard about is sectarianism. I'm talking about a ruling government right now, which we describe as Hindu nationalist. And for the most part, we have to understand that Hindu nationalism or being a Hindu nationalist government does not mean the politicians themselves are religious fanatics. That's not what it is. I mean, they could be, but in this case, they aren't. And this has been the case, ever since the beginning of the Bharatiya Janata Party in the late 70s. Its origins go back to the late 70s. Was that many of its politicians, including some of its original leaders like Atal Bihari Vajpayee, were kind of, I would say center right politically, but they had discovered that they could use religion as a means of getting votes. Right? They could use religion as a means of getting votes because religion evokes passion. If you can evoke the passion of the voters, okay, they will go out, they will show up at the polls, and they will persuade others. And that's what this is about. I mean, this is what the Republicans, using evangelical Christianity, and I mean, some of them really believe it, but they're also using it because they know that they can evoke this loyalty, these passionate supporters. I mean, the passion of Trump supporters is driven in part by religious appeals. Right? So it took the BJP government a few years to sort of gain its confidence, and then consolidating its position in the parliament to start putting forth some of these bills, and then passing them in like in 2019 the Citizenship Amendment Act. So what the Citizenship Amendment Act does, and of course there are many citizenship acts, and there have been successive amendments. So what this amendment does is that instead of having a just simply criteria, just across the board criteria for granting people citizenship, or recognizing citizenship based upon either being born in India or that you have parents that were born in India. And then of course there is also a process it's very restrictive for someone to become a naturalized citizen. But there are the point is that before, these procedures applied no matter who you were. And this amendment says that it discriminates by saying we're giving a preference to some people, right? You give a preference to some people as a way of saying that we're going to discriminate against these others. So what it says is that we're going to give a special preference for citizenship to for example, refugees who are Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Sikh, Jain, Jewish, all of these, but not Muslims. Right? So Muslims are barred from that. And the largest number of refugees in India are in fact Muslim, right? Because there are we don't know the number, 10, 15 million refugees from Bangladesh. Many of them go back to the 1970 War of Independence, and they are residing primarily in West Bengal and Assam. These are two states in the Far East. And then we have the Rohingya. So Rohingya refugees from Myanmar are sitting in camps. We're talking about 1 million of them in camps in Bangladesh, but tens of thousands of them have also flowed into India, Eastern India. So they're on, and these are all Muslims. So this is a way of saying that these major refugee influxes will be, that these people will not be recognized, that they will be stateless. Now, along with that is the National Population Registry. I probably am taking too long. I probably have to move more quickly. So I'll just say that the National Population Registry, together with the National Register of Citizens, is an attempt to tighten the definition and the numbers of people who have citizenship. And then once you have this data, then you can say to the non-citizens, okay, you either have to leave, and certainly you won't get state benefits and all of that. A lot of the similar things that Trump would have done to undocumented immigrants in the US. So there have been huge protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the implementation of the two registries, the Citizenship Registry and Population Registry. And there have been many protests here in the US and Canada as well. Now, Kashmir I want to touch on Kashmir because it still is a flashpoint. It was a flashpoint in 1947 because, at partition, Kashmir, the status of Kashmir was left undefined for a few months until the Maharaja of Kashmir signed the instrument of accession to India. And this was unique for several reasons. One, because Kashmir was the only Muslim majority area that acceded to India, or at least the only Muslim majority area that acceded to India that did not have a border with either Pakistan or Bangladesh. There are other Muslim majority areas like Lucknow, in central India, but they had no border with a Muslim state. And it was controversial because Pakistan claims all of Kashmir and India claims all of Kashmir. And So the constitution, which was implemented in 1950, contained Article 370. Article 370 granted special status to Kashmir. It said that Kashmir would have autonomy in the same sense, in the same legal sense that Russia and China have autonomous regions. It would have its own constitution. It would have its own flag, and it would be able to handle its internal affairs, except for foreign affairs and defense. And last year, the Parliament revoked Article 370 of the Constitution. And again, there's a lot of controversy about whether this was even legal, but does the Parliament have the power to revoke an article of the Constitution? And once again, the issue here is that, well, the courts are stacked, and so the courts will not challenge it. And the conflict there, because there have been a lot of jihad groups that have been supported by Pakistan, this has for long been the most militarized region in the world, in the sense that there are more soldiers there than per capita than any other place in the world, including Israel, including so many other places. And so I have to make this comparison with Xinjiang, because I've been to Xinjiang, and in the US, every time there's a reference to China, there's talk about human rights violations in Xinjiang. And the policing in Xinjiang is done by police, not by military. It is a very highly policed region, but I can travel there. I cannot travel to Kashmir. Okay, the internet works in Xinjiang. It doesn't work in Kashmir because the government shut it down, or shuts it down periodically. So the tightness of the control in Kashmir is much greater than it is in Xinjiang. Just to give you an example. So when we talk about human rights violations, we need to put them into perspective. And well, this just shows any contested area has a lot of borders, right? So this whole region is Kashmir, and it is, the green is in Pakistan, the yellow is under Chinese control, even though both Pakistan and India claim those areas, as well as the white, the Siachen Glacier is also claimed by all three, and China actually controls it right now. And then the blue is the Jammu and Kashmir, which is one part of the state of Kashmir, is the state of Kashmir that India controls, is the blue, and I don't know how to say, the reddish area. Those two put together are the state of Kashmir that India controls. And Ladakh has a Buddhist majority, because there are people who are related to Tibet in that area. And then Kashmir, so the northern part of the blue area is Muslim majority, and the southern part, Jammu, is a Hindu majority. That's how complicated it is. Let's keep going. Finally, I do want to spend a little bit of time here on talking about growing authoritarianism. And of course, India as a former British colony has a long history of draconian laws that were designed by the colonial power to keep the immense population of India under control. And you can be sure that from the very beginning, there have been uprisings, there have been rebellions, there have been mutinies, and British have crafted laws to deal with these kinds of uprisings, such as the Bengal Regulation 1812, Prevention of Seditious Meetings Act, and the Defense of India Act. So the Defense of India Act is used whenever there is a foreign actor. And in 1915, the foreign actor was not a country. It was the Ghadar movement of Sikh activists based in California and in Canada, who were supplying arms and who were living here, and they volunteered to go back to India to fight against the British. And so the British invoked the Defense of India Act and amended it to deal with the what they call the Ghadar conspiracy. Post-independence, we have the Preventive Detention Act. Defense of India Act again is amended in 1962 to clamp down against protest during the first India-China War, 1962. The Maintenance of Internal Security Act, the MESA, was crafted in 1971 to deal with the Naxalbari uprising, the Maoist uprising that began in 1967, and then was used very extensively in the state of emergency that Indira Gandhi declared in 1975. The National Security Act was because the previous 2 years was the only 2 years that there was no preventive detention. There was no legal preventive detention in India in 78, 79. And so the National Security Act was invoked to fill that gap. And then we have another series of acts, the TARA, the Terrorism and Disruptive Activities Act, began in 1985 in response to the Sikh separatist movement, the Khalistan movement, and the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the POTA, beginning in 2002 to deal with Islamic terrorism, and then throughout there has been the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, has been amended many times to deal with perceived threats to the integrity of the state, and most recently was used to imprison a number of my activist colleagues, including some whom I live with, Sudha Bharadwaj, Vinayak Sen, and other activists, intellectuals, being jailed not for any activity. They're not charged with an activity because there is no charge. They are charged. The basis of the charge is that they are, and it's unsubstantiated, that they are members of a subversive group, a Maoist group, and there's no proof of that. It's all concocted. But anyway, so these are some of the draconian acts. So it raises the question about, if we see a trend towards growing authoritarianism in the world's largest democracy, it's important to keep this in mind. And in the hands of a right-wing government that uses its mass organizations to incite violence against minorities. For example, it is inciting, not directly, the Prime Minister will never say this, but some of the mass organizations that are associated with the BJP are talking about, are inciting people. So if someone is suspected of having killed a cow it will rouse a mob to go and attack or kill the people who are alleged to have killed the cow. Okay. This kind of thing. And then there's the whole thing about we'll talk a little bit about. So these are the tribes or Adivasis, and there are a lot of left-wing movements by the Adivasis because they are a marginalized community, and this is one of them. One of the armed struggles that took place in the 1946 to 1952 in the southern state of Andhra Pradesh. And these red areas are, if you look at the map of India, even today, it hasn't changed much. These are the areas where leftist guerrillas, armed guerrillas, still operate and have liberated zones in India. And so a lot of these laws are designed to deal with these insurgencies, and particularly the left insurgencies. And the most recent example of this was an event. This will be my final example, but this was in January of 2018, January 1st, and this was a march by Dalits, or led by Dalits. And Dalits are the so-called untouchables, the excluded caste. And they were marching on the 200th anniversary of a battle between the British. So what the British did, is that they recruited into their army Indians. There were regiments of Indians, for example, the Gurkhas from Nepal, and then Dalits, another regiment, recruited into the British Army to keep law and order in the colony. And so this Dalit regiment fought a battle against the Peshwa army, which is an elite Hindu. So we're talking about a Maharaja, a Hindu Maharaja, is defeated by Dalit troops. And this has a lot of contradictions, right? Because on the one hand, we would support the Hindu army because it's fighting British colonialism, and on the other hand, it was for Dalits. It was a moment of pride that Dalits, the untouchables and untouchable troops, even though they were for the British, defeated Brahmin Hindus, high caste Hindus, and so the government, because this is a right-wing Hindu nationalist government, it really struck a chord with this government and said that we have to crush this. We have to crush this one. And so my friends, of whom Sudha Bharadwaj was one of them, was alleged to have played a role in this march, and even if she did, it was a peaceful march. There was no law was violated, but she was arrested. They targeted her because of her association with this march. We wanted to crush this, and because it was an affront to high caste Hindus that to celebrate a victory over high caste Hindus by Dalits. So I'm going to. So anyway, the other thing to think about is that there's a lot of talk now about rising fascism in India, and we have to take this seriously. We also have to to use a scientific definition of fascism. It's not just, rampant police state. It's about othering and scapegoating of minorities. It's about rousing a population to attack those scapegoated minorities, or foreigners, or perceived foreigners, and that's what's happening in the world, and that's why it is at least a proto-fascist direction that is India is moving in. The only thing that makes it a little bit less threatening is that if you compare Modi to Trump, Trump was so irrational, so inconsistent. Modi at least, maintains his personal dignity, rationality, seems to. But the point is that he will not act against this rising proto-fascism. I'm sure this has raised a lot of questions, and there's a lot to think about here in what will be the world's largest country. But I'll close my talk here and discuss whatever is on the mind. So thank you very much.
Do you happen to know the number of people in jail? I mean, do they have very big jail system?
India does not have a very large jail system. So India has less than 500,000 people in jail. Okay. China has about 1 million. The US has about 2.3 million.
Back to the farm bills, on the surface, they look okay. It's like opening up the trade system so that the farmers can sell to not just only the nationally controlled sectors, but to the private sectors. The question is, does India still maintain the national sectors so that that is one of the choices, so that if the farmers want to sell with a basic price guarantee, they can still do that, or is that abolished?
No, so the state trading system will still exist.
Okay.
Okay, it will still exist, but when these farmers sell to private traders, there will no longer be a minimum support price.
Yeah, so why do they choose to sell to the private if the national is still in existence?
Well, so it depends upon where they can sell, right? What is the location of sale? If the mandis that will buy at the minimum support price are far away, right? And a trader comes to you and says, I'll buy your produce and I'll transport it, but I'll pay a much lower price, right? So it's opening up the system to that situation.
I understand. It could be a matter of, I'm just thinking about the suicides by the farmers in the 300,000 and more. And since they still have choices of selling, doing the old system, is it more of the situation of going through a transition of the different ways of doing business and they just couldn't adjust?
That the farmers cannot adjust to it. Is that what you're saying? So sure, it's a transition in the sense that it's going to open up more players in the food trading system. Okay. But what will happen though is that as private trade increases, the economy of scale of state trading facilities will decline. right? So eventually, we don't know what will happen, but some of those state trading facilities could close. They would close maybe some Mondays, some warehouses. You know, we don't know what implications this has down the road. The other thing is that the retail buyers of food are changing, right? Because historically, and even until well, even today, I mean, let's take what is the situation today? The situation today is that if I'm living in an Indian city and I want to buy food, I can go to like a farmer's market, produce market. I can go to a small shop. So this is an individual shopkeeper, most of whose employees are family members. So it's a very small scale, and that's still the current situation. There are a few big supermarkets that are starting, that have started in the last few years, and these are mostly owned by large Indian capitalists. So you have Reliance, you have Bajaj, you have some of these big Indian business houses opening up supermarkets, and they are becoming increasing buyers. But what the foreign companies want is that, well, I mean, Walmart, Tesco, Carrefour, these companies want to come in and play a major role in the Indian retail sector. And one thing is for sure, it's just like Walmart has wiped out among small shopkeepers in the US, it's going to have an even more devastating impact in India, where the shopkeepers are really, really small. Right? I mean, you can have, it's literally a shop that is as wide as their doorway, and only about, you know, maybe 10 feet back. That's a shop.
Actually, it just dawned on me, the suicide may not be because of the laws made so that they are trading to multiple parties. The suicide is mostly caused by bankruptcy, in that because the Monsanto selling seeds that cannot be seeds anymore, and so they go bankrupt. I think that is really the cause. So Monsanto is committing genocide.
Right. It's Monsanto and a few other companies
Yes.
like Bayer. And so what's happening is that also with these high yielding varieties, and so high yielding varieties require more inputs, they require more fertilizer, they require more pesticides. And so per plant, you may get a higher yield, but you have to pay for all these inputs. And then there's the other question is, what is the health impact of using more pesticides, you know, and then fertilizer? Where does fertilizer come from? It comes from fossil fuels. So it forces India to import more crude oil, and which is ultimately bad in terms of greenhouse gas production. Right? There's all kinds of things. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the piracy that was done by Monsanto, and whether the huge Indian Pharma Strike that happened, I think, in 1990 or might be 1989, also a huge wave of resistance against Monsanto, if that had any good effect in terms of like ending some of the more egregious demands of Monsanto and the other seed companies. Did the Indian farmers have any kind of success then as a result of that strike?
Well, a lot of it was education. Was that you know, farmers through this experience, came to realize the pitfalls of high yielding varieties and GMO varieties, but the problem is that how do you go back? Because you know what happens with genetically modified seed is that you plant something and that plant produces seed. That seed drifts across, goes up into the air. It mates with other plants. And so the entire, all the plants in that area become contaminated. So you cannot, unless you go back to a seed bank, right? Unless there was enough forethought to create a seed bank, there's no original seed to go back to. And this is happening in Mexico, same thing with US
Yeah.
GMO corn coming in, and just contaminating the genetic repository. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know specifically. I mean, I think that the outcome of that farmer strike was that there is more provision of alternatives to Monsanto, to GMO seeds. And so at least there are options, and there are a lot of successes. You know, there's so many struggles that are going on. So every time there's a Coca-Cola plant. And by the way, Coca-Cola was banned in India in 1977, right? And so what happened? Okay, I'll tell you that story. So Coca-Cola was banned in 1977 by the Junta government at the end of the emergency. And the Food Institute of India had, and I don't know why they were doing this kind of research, but this is a government institute, developed the formula for Coke, the secret formula. I mean, they reverse engineered it, okay, and then they supplied it to two Indian companies, Thumbs Up and Double 7, or is it 777? But anyway, so India had two brands of cola that were as good as Coca-Cola and Pepsi. And then Pepsi bought up one of those. I mean, this is many years later. Pepsi bought up one, and the Coke bought the other. So we're back to where we started. Yes, I think you had a
Yeah, I
question.
had a political question.
Sure.
As as India drifts towards this right-wing fascism, how strong is the opposition party? I mean, we were lucky enough to defeat Trump in the last election. What are the chances of this party being defeated?
So the fortunes of the ruling party, of the BJP, have been impacted by the COVID pandemic, the failures of this government to have a rational, approach to managing the COVID pandemic. So that is going to negatively impact their prospects in upcoming elections. But you see that I didn't show this is the electoral map in 2014, and it hasn't changed too much. So basically since then, the BJP has won 21 more constituencies. So in other words, there would be 21 more districts, electoral districts, that would be orange than are on this map. So this is their odds. It's that they have an overwhelming lead right now. They have an absolute majority in the parliament, and it's going to be very hard to overcome that. Why is this? Well, this is the reason that politicians use religious appeals. So let's clarify something about religion. In the US, when we talk about religion, we usually think of people who practice a particular religion. And so we give a list, okay, so many people are Muslim, or so many are Sunni, so many are Shia, so many are Episcopalian, so many are Presbyterian, etc. In Asia, that's not what it means. So in Asia, religion is not a practice, it's a community. So for example, I'm an atheist, but in India, I belong to the Hindu community. So, and that's just because that's where my family, how they identify. And yeah, they go through the rituals and that sort of thing. And I sort of defied it by naming one of my sons, giving him a Muslim name, a name that sounds Muslim. But so it's about community. And so when a major political party appeals to religion, they're not appealing to so much to religious fundamentalism as they're saying that we identify with the 79% who are of the Hindu community. That's what it means politically in India. And so if you are the party of the majority, that is a very powerful force that gets them the votes, regardless of how they perform.
The Congress Party, Nehru, and then the original were sort of based on rationality as opposed to religion. Has that party disintegrated or
Good
disappeared?
question. Good question. So the Congress the Congress Party is leading the UPA, United Progressive Alliance. That is the areas that are blue or bluish. It's very small. And there are many reasons for its demise. One is because people look back and say, well, you failed. You were in power since independence, and you basically failed us. The corruption is still there. It's still rampant. It's very hard to get anything done, to start a business, to do anything. And that's one problem. Second is the dynasty. People are now fed up with the dynasty, the Nehru dynasty. And yet the Congress Party keeps on putting forth as its leading candidate a member of the Nehru family. And I don't know. But those are some of the main reasons that I see in the Congress Party's decline, and then also factionalism. So there are many different Congress parties. There are many people who have split off from the Congress Party, again for many of the same reasons. And then similarly, there's been a dramatic decline of left parties, because not because of corruption. The left parties have been clean, but because they get fossilized over the decades. Their projection looks like they're doing the same old thing. So the Communist Party of India Marxist, which is the dark red, now it used to control the governments in Kerala, which is down here in the south, and in West Bengal, which is up there. And in West Bengal, the light green is a new party, a relatively new party, just because it has a fresh approach. And then the only state it still controls is Tripura, which is the I
Can
think
you
I
talk a
think-
little about the caste system? Is it still as strong as it ever has been? And what's going on?
okay.
How much overlap is there with party and caste?
Yes,
Okay.
so caste is of course still there. There is a lot of it is about caste is being well, I shouldn't say a lot, but some of it there's one way of looking at it. There are many ways of indicators, but one way of measuring it is for example, that's very visible is in India, you know, that when people get married, they put ads in newspapers, right, matrimonials. And of course now it's mostly done online. But the matrimonials will say, the traditional matrimonials will say, you know, the prospective bride is of this caste, and they're looking for a mate. And it doesn't say that the mate has to be of the same caste, but it's sort of the implication. Then there are the ads which are about maybe 20%. That's a substantial number, which specifically say caste no bar. So caste is not a barrier. So intercaste marriage is fine. Doesn't mean that interreligious marriage is fine, but intercaste marriage is okay. So there is some opening up over time, but we see that a lot of where it makes a difference is for example, in hiring in the private sector. A lot of hiring or recruitment is what happens is that the people of a certain caste who tend to dominate in the company or department will hire more people from the same caste. And this is what is at the heart of the Cisco case. So there's a caste discrimination lawsuit against Cisco Systems because a Dalit was discriminated, alleges that he was discriminated against inside Cisco. So a lot of these things get transplanted to here in the US. As far as the BJP's philosophy is concerned, you know, overtly, it's not so much a question of assertion of Brahmin dominance. It's not so much that. It's more about Hinduization. So it's kind of like the situation in Turkey. Is that the rulers in Turkey from Ataturk onwards have wanted everyone in Turkey to identify as Turkish. And anyone who didn't, so the Armenians were a problem because the Armenians were a problem because not only did they speak a different language and write a different language, but they also had a different religion than the Christians. So they had to be exterminated. The Kurds were a problem, but the Kurds are Muslim. And so a Kurd can blend into Turkish society if he or she becomes Turkified. So it's the same thing in India with the Lord, you know, so this whole thing about love jihad, I didn't tell you that, is that conversions, religious conversions and inter-religious marriages are prohibited under this it's an emerging concept. It's not there yet, but this government, the BJP government, wants to do this, and it's what it wants to do is to bar Hindus from converting to Buddhists or Muslims and Christians, but but the proposed law is that conversion back to the ancestral religion is okay. Now, why is that okay? Because historically, go back far enough, before the Mughals, everybody was Hindu or Buddhist. So conversion back to Hinduism or Buddhism is okay. That's the idea. So it's not so much about caste, but caste is there in the background, and there have been a lot of attacks, physical attacks against Dalits and lower castes, like Shudras, so the lowest, within the caste system. You could say that Dalits are outside of the caste system. Shudras are the lowest tier within the caste system, but they're all Hindus. Complicated. Anyway, so it's Judy.
I wonder if the farmers, do they have representation in the government? I mean, or and among the masses? Where did the farmers get the most support from?
Well, the farmers are, and their families are a huge proportion of the population. So sure, there are people in other sectors who will support them, intellectuals, students, obviously there will be that support. But farmers and farm workers represent at least 60% of the population today, even though there's been all this urbanization.
Do they vote?
Absolutely.
Do they have representatives in the government?
Yes. Well, they don't have. There are no reserved seats for farmers. There are reserved. No, I guess not in terms of seats, but and there are no reservations in terms of jobs for farmers because they have their own occupation. But 40, if you just take 40% of the farmers and farm workers, that's a majority. That's an absolute majority of the voting population. I don't know if that answers your question.
It's unlike our system. It's by popular vote. Whoever gets the most vote gets the seat, right?
That's right.
And everyone is qualified to vote if they are over certain age, if they have citizenship.
If they have citizenship.
What percentage of the population votes?
So in recent elections, 66%.
That's better than ours.
Yeah. Right. So I've done this isn't a subject of another talk, but I've done a lot of election observing, and particularly in Latin America, and most of the world actually holds elections on Sundays or on the Sabbath, whatever the Sabbath is. And the United States and Canada are two of a very small number of countries that hold elections on working days. So that is one factor in voter turnout.
Is it true that the government shut down all internet during that strike?
No, it did not. So there was no. I mean, there may have been some selective, blackouts of certain websites. but there have been plenty of requests, government requests of Facebook and Twitter to take down content. So that's another big controversy is the internet companies are facing. And you know, in the US, we hear about how internet companies are being challenged in China. We don't hear about how they're being challenged in India. It's probably just as much attempt by the government to censor online content in India as there is in China.
And does India have the equivalent of the Patriot Act to surveil private?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, so this I mean, just like the MISA Act that I discussed earlier was used for surveillance. That was one of the legal bases for the creation of the RAW, the Research and Analysis Wing, which is the partial equivalent of the NSA. It was created during the emergency in 1975. So you know, that infrastructure is definitely there.
I have one question.
Sure.
I was curious about the Red Fort in Delhi when the protesters took control of it. Did that have the same effect as desecrating the Capitol building on January 26th? Was it such a sacred site, or was that, what was the impact of that? Was it especially impactful?
Well, their objective was not to attack. Their objective was to it's just like you have a protest, you want to take control of an intersection. I mean, or take the Golden Gate Bridge. That's it. It was not to like disrupt the seat of government and to deface it, to damage it. That was not the goal. So some people may interpret it that way. The objective is as far as I know. I think Julia.
Yes, is military service a voluntary or compulsory?
It's voluntary. It's voluntary.
Voluntary.
And I think it's because India has such a huge population, and there are so many people in poverty, so the military service attracts enough people, enough recruits. I mean, India is not extraordinarily, so the Indian armed forces are a little over 1 million, which is not an extraordinarily large number considering the population. But there are a lot of paramilitary forces. So the border security force, the Central Reserve Police. If you add up all the paramilitary forces that are under control of the central government, they represent maybe probably close to 1 million in the paramilitary force.
I have a question which is now related to your presentation, that in the Silicon Valley, since the 1990s, there's a rise of Indian engineers and entrepreneurs and the venture capitalists. And the question is there a brain drain from India to America? And those people who have made it, are they taking something back to India or returning to India to help?
So yes, there is a very substantial migration of skilled people from India to the US, particularly in Silicon Valley. And a lot of these people come here on H-1B visas, which are visas that are sponsored by visa applications that are sponsored by tech corporations, where they are required to specify that the applicant, the person whom they're trying to bring here, has a set of skills that are in short supply in the US. So it's skill based. And so these are highly trained people. Does it contribute to a brain drain? Absolutely. If you take some of the best public educational institutions, like the IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology, and there are 7 of them, and one of them in particular, the IIT Kanpur. So the IIT, the 7 IITs were founded as a collaboration between the government of India, the Ministry of Education, also DST, Department of Science and Technology, and a foreign country. So the IIT Kharagpur, for example, was collaboration with Russia. IIT Delhi was a collaboration with Britain, I think. IIT Madras was a collaboration, I think, with Germany. And IIT Kanpur was a collaboration with the US. And because of those connections with the US, I would say that it could even be a majority of the graduates of IIT Kanpur end up coming to the US. And only a handful go back. So it's definitely a brain drain. And it's an issue. In my family, we have so many doctors who have come to the US. So there must be a dozen doctors from my family alone.
Physicians.
Physicians that have come to the US. And as far as I know, they are settled here. They're not going back. I think we can close. Thank you very much.